The first thing the neighbors noticed wasn't the couple moving in, or even the for sale sign being quietly taken down. It was the light. A pale yellow glow that leaked through the curtained windows of Ian Holm's old house, long after midnight, long after the new owners claimed they were asleep. Sometimes it flickered, like a projector stuttering in an empty theater. Other times it burned steady, illuminating the darkened garden, as if someone were rehearsing a scene no one was meant to see. The house itself, tucked away in Hampstead, London, had always carried a certain weight. Once the home of Sir Ian Holm, the celebrated actor whose face audiences remembered from Alien and The Lord of the Rings, it stood in quiet dignity, brick walls covered in ivy, the garden left slightly overgrown since his death. To most, it was simply another piece of London history changing hands. To the new owners, Tom and Claire, it was a bargain. To the neighbors, it was a place they crossed the street to avoid. The first week passed quietly enough. Boxes unpacked, furniture arranged, laughter echoing faintly through the high-ceilinged rooms. Yet, in the second week, Tom began to notice small things. A faint smell of cigarette smoke, though neither of them smoked. The sound of footsteps upstairs while he was alone in the kitchen. A cold draft that seemed to follow him specifically, as though it were choosing where to move. But it was Claire who saw him first. Late one night, padding to the bathroom in the dark, she froze at the end of the hallway. There, by the study door, stood a figure short, solid, dressed in what looked like an old tweed jacket. His face was partly shadowed, but she caught the unmistakable outline of sharp features, the kind that had once commanded both stage and screen. He didn't move. He simply looked at her, eyes locked, before fading into the darkness as if he had stepped back into some unseen stage wing. The next morning, she tried to laugh it off, telling Tom she must have been half asleep. But she knew the truth. Ian Holm had not left his house. And worse, the longer they stayed, the more insistent his presence became. The following nights pressed down on the house like a heavy velvet curtain, suffocating and still. Tom, pragmatic by nature, tried to reason with himself about the oddities Claire mentioned. He explained away the smell of smoke as lingering residue in the old plaster walls, the footsteps as shifting floorboards, the drafts as the quirks of a house that had been standing for decades. Yet, as each hour of darkness unfolded, those explanations grew thinner, more fragile, as though his own mind refused to believe the comfort he was offering himself. The study became the core of their unease. The room had once been Holmes' sanctuary, where scripts were scattered across the desk, where annotated sides of Hamlet and King Lear bore his handwriting, and where books lined the shelves with cracked spines and faded dust jackets. The air inside was different, dense, almost charged, as though the molecules vibrated with something unseen. Even in daylight, shadows seemed reluctant to leave, gathering in the corners like stagehands waiting for their cue. One evening, while Claire prepared tea, Tom wandered into the study. His hand brushed across the oak desk, tracing the grooves and scratches left by decades of use. That's when he saw it. A stack of papers that hadn't been there before. Not yellowed, not dusty, but stark white, as though freshly placed. At first he thought they were blank, until the angle of the lamp caught the faint imprint of words, lines, dialogue, written in pencil. They were lines from Alien. He knew them, remembered Holmes' performance as Ash, the android whose calm precision masked something sinister. The words appeared almost carved into the paper, indented as if written by a heavy hand. But when Tom touched the sheet, there was no graphite residue, no pencil to smudge, only impressions, pressed deep into the fibers. He hurried out of the room, the tea in Claire's hands trembling as she caught sight of his pale face. He didn't tell her right away, but that night, lying in bed, he whispered it into the dark. Claire stayed silent, but he felt her grip his hand tighter under the covers, her breathing unsteady, as though confirming what she had already feared. Something was still performing in that house. The neighbors, curious but cautious, offered their whispers when Tom asked casually about Holmes' final years. They said he had kept mostly to himself in those last days, the curtains always drawn, the lights flickering late into the night as if he never quite stopped rehearsing. One woman, her eyes darting toward the house as though afraid it might overhear, mentioned hearing Holmes' voice through an open window long after he had passed. Not a memory, not an echo clear as day, as though he were in the middle of a monologue. Claire began to notice other things. At the edge of mirrors, she would catch fleeting reflections that didn't belong to her or Tom. A hand adjusting a tie, a face turning slightly as though seeking its light. She tried to ignore them, but the reflections grew sharper, lingering longer, until she found herself avoiding the bathroom mirror entirely. The glass seemed less like a surface and more like a window, something she wasn't meant to look through. The breaking point came one damp night when rain tapped against the windows and the wind carried a low whistle through the garden ivy. Tom had fallen asleep on the couch, the television flickering muted images across his tired face. Claire, restless, wandered into the study again. The air felt colder than the rest of the house, and as she moved toward the desk, she heard it soft at first, then undeniable. A voice, low and steady, reciting lines. Not conversational, but theatrical, rhythmic, the cadence of an actor locked into performance. She froze by the desk, the papers spread before her, and in the dim lamp light, the figure materialized. He wasn't solid, not fully, but detailed enough to be unmistakable. The tweed jacket, the fine lines of an older face, the piercing eyes that seemed to demand attention. Sir Ian Holm stood before her, not as the man he was in life, but as something else caught between the role of actor and apparition. His mouth moved with precision, delivering words she didn't understand, his gaze never wavering from hers. Claire staggered backward, her hand clutching the doorframe, but the voice followed, filling the room, resonating in her chest as though the house itself were amplifying his performance. When she finally managed to pull the door shut, the sound cut off instantly, leaving her in suffocating silence, her breath shallow, her pulse racing in her ears. When she told Tom the next morning, her voice cracked, not from disbelief, but from exhaustion. She knew what she had seen, and she knew what he would think. But Tom didn't laugh, didn't argue. Instead, he looked at her with hollow eyes and confessed what he had been hiding 2 nights earlier. While she slept, he had seen the same figure standing at the end of their bed, watching them both in silence. And it hadn't disappeared. It had leaned closer. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The house seemed to shift after that night, as though it had finally acknowledged its new occupants. Before, the oddities had been fleeting, uncertain footsteps, flickers, impressions on paper. Now they grew deliberate, persistent, and impossible to dismiss. Tom and Claire found themselves drawn into a rhythm not their own, as if the house had its own script and they were simply filling roles. Morning light no longer brought comfort. The rooms remained dim, as though the sun had lost its strength once it crossed the threshold. Dust floated in slow spirals, catching the beams that filtered weakly through the drawn curtains. Even the air felt staged thick, still, charged with anticipation, as if the walls were waiting for their next cue. Tom began waking at the same hour each night, 3:15. He would stir suddenly, heart hammering, unsure if a sound had woken him or if something else had pulled him from sleep. Each time he swore he felt eyes on him, the weight of a presence pressing down, watching. More than once, he glanced to the corner of their bedroom and thought he saw a silhouette, small, stocky, shoulders squared, as if someone were preparing to step into a spotlight. Claire, meanwhile, had grown wary of the study. She avoided it during the day, yet she found herself drawn to it after dusk, compelled by something she couldn't name. When she pushed the door open, the smell of tobacco hung heavy, stronger than before. On the desk, new pages appeared. Not always script lines, sometimes fragments of poetry, sometimes a single phrase written over and over in ghostly indentations, as though Holmes' hand had never stopped rehearsing. One evening, she found just 3 words pressed into the sheet, so deep they nearly tore the paper: "Don't forget me." Her hands trembled as she held it, and she realized the truth of what she feared. This was not a haunting born of malice, it was a haunting born of desperation. A man who had given his life to performance, who had become immortal in film and theater, but who, within his own walls, seemed to cling to something unfinished. The garden, too, began to change. Tom noticed the ivy along the back wall was dying in strange patches, curling as though scorched, despite the autumn rains. When he went out to touch the brittle leaves, he saw impressions in the soil footprints that led toward the back door and stopped abruptly, as if the figure had walked into the house without opening it. The neighbors grew more distant. Conversations on the street ended quickly when Tom or Claire passed. It was as though the house had already gained a new reputation, whispered about over hedges and through half-closed windows. One elderly neighbor, after too much wine one evening, muttered that the home place was cursed not because of tragedy, but because of its silence. An actor's house should not fall silent, she said, eyes glassy. The stage follows them. If it ends too soon, the performance stays. That thought gnawed at Claire. At night, when she lay awake beside Tom, she heard faint murmurs from the study, words just beyond recognition. They weren't chaotic, weren't random, they had a rhythm, a beat, as if someone were pacing, rehearsing. Once, unable to resist, she slipped from bed and pressed her ear to the study door. The voice inside was unmistakable, clear, articulate, carrying the cadence of a trained actor. Holmes' voice. She pressed her hand against the wood, trembling, and for a moment the voice stopped as if it had sensed her. Then, in a low whisper that cut through her bones, it spoke directly, deliberately, and undeniably, "You're late for your cue." Claire staggered back, gasping, her throat tight. She fled to the bedroom, locking the door behind her. But when she returned the next morning, the study appeared untouched, the desk bare, the air strangely neutral, as though the house was mocking her fear, daring her to believe her own memory. Tom noticed her silence at breakfast. He didn't press her, didn't ask. He only nodded slowly, his face pale, his eyes fixed on the kitchen wall. Then, after a long pause, he whispered what she had already begun to dread. "I think he wants us to join the performance." The days that followed moved with an unnatural rhythm, as though time in the house ticked differently. Outside, Hampstead bustled with its usual charm, cafes spilling onto cobblestone streets, children in school uniforms chattering at bus stops, the scent of fresh bread rising from corner bakeries. But inside the home house, every hour seemed thick, stretched, carrying a weight that made Tom and Claire feel perpetually on edge. Tom began working from home more often, though he found it impossible to concentrate. His laptop sat open on the dining table, but his eyes drifted constantly toward the study door, as if magnetized. Several times a day, he swore he heard the click of the lamp turning on inside, though when he checked, the room was dark. Once, he pushed the door open and found the lamp glowing steadily, the bulb casting a weak yellow haze across the desk. He reached to switch it off, but before his fingers touched the chain, it snapped off by itself, plunging the room into shadow. Claire, meanwhile, noticed subtle shifts in the atmosphere of their bedroom. The mirror on her vanity no longer felt like hers. When she sat to brush her hair in the morning, she would catch fleeting details that didn't belong: shoulder pads of an old suit jacket, a tie knotted tightly at the collar, a face lingering just behind hers. Each time she spun around, the room was empty, but the reflection stayed vivid in her mind, as though Holmes' presence wasn't bound by walls or rooms, but by sight itself. Their nights grew restless. The sounds of pacing filled the upper floor, deliberate and unhurried, as though someone was moving from wall to wall, rehearsing in silence. At first, Tom tried to chase the noises, flinging open doors, charging down hallways. But the more he tried, the clearer it became that the steps weren't meant to be found. They were meant to be heard, the same way an audience hears an actor offstage preparing for his entrance. One night, Claire woke to find Tom sitting upright, drenched in sweat, staring at the corner of the room. His lips moved soundlessly, his eyes wide, as if he were repeating something under his breath. She shook him until he blinked, disoriented, and finally muttered, He was giving me lines. He wanted me to say them back." When she pressed him, Tom could only recall fragments. Words about death, memory, and the stage, words delivered in a cadence too precise to be his own. He confessed that Holmes' presence hadn't just been watching him, it had been instructing him. And Tom, half asleep and defenseless, had obeyed. The intrusion deepened in subtle, invasive ways. Household objects moved with unsettling precision. A teacup always reappeared on the desk in the study, no matter where Claire placed it. The living room curtains shifted slightly open each evening at dusk, as if to let an unseen audience peer inside. Scripts that neither of them owned began to appear, first scattered lines, then entire pages tucked into drawers, taped beneath chairs, slipped between the pages of their books. All bore the same strange quality. No ink, no graphite, only impressions pressed deep into the fibers, as though Holmes' hand had etched his words without a tool. One damp evening, as rain streaked down the windows, Claire decided she could no longer avoid the study. She entered with a glass of wine in hand, her nerves rattling. The air inside was heavy with the scent of smoke and something older, something metallic, like the faint tang of blood. The desk lamp flicked on by itself as she stepped closer, its light catching the pages spread across the oak surface. They were covered in dialogue, but this time not from Holmes' films. These were lines from Shakespeare, Lear, Hamlet, Macbeth. Familiar words that filled her with dread, for each passage circled around madness, betrayal, and death. The silence broke with the creak of a chair. She turned sharply and saw him. Ian Holm sat in the corner, not fully formed, yet not transparent either. His face was lined, his frame slight, his tweed jacket unmistakable. He leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on his knees, watching her. His mouth moved in slow, deliberate rhythm, though the words reached her only as a muffled hum, like dialogue underwater. Still, she felt the force of his presence, the sheer intensity of eyes trained on her as if she were the only person in a theater of thousands. Her breath caught. She staggered back, nearly dropping the glass, but the apparition only leaned closer. The muffled hum sharpened, rising to clarity. His voice cut the silence, low and commanding. "You are part of this now." Claire fled the room, her body trembling violently. But even as she stumbled into the hallway, she realized the study door had not stayed behind her, it had slammed shut on its own, echoing through the house with a finality that made her knees buckle. That night, as Tom held her in silence, neither spoke of leaving. Both knew instinctively what the other feared. Leaving would not matter. The haunting wasn't in the house alone. The performance had already begun, and they were no longer just witnesses. They were cast. The house no longer belonged to them. Tom and Claire began to move through its rooms like intruders, careful with each step, lowering their voices as though they were trespassing on sacred ground. Sleep became fragmented, meals left unfinished, conversations thin and half-whispered. Everything in their lives bent toward the same center, the invisible pull of Ian Holm's presence. It was Tom who gave in first. At night, while Claire lay rigid beside him, he would murmur lines in his sleep, his mouth moving with uncanny precision. She would shake him awake, only to find him confused, blinking as though surfacing from a deep rehearsal. But the words remained on his lips, phrases borrowed from plays he had never read. One morning she found him at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in front of him, scribbling dialogue furiously onto a notepad. The handwriting was not his. The letters were too neat, the pressure too deep, the style eerily close to the indents they had seen pressed into ghostly sheets of paper. When she tore the page away, Tom only looked at her blankly, as if she had stolen something vital. Claire tried to resist longer, but resistance had its limits. One late evening, she heard the faint murmur of rehearsed lines drifting through the house. Following the sound, she reached the study. The door was half open, the light glowing faintly inside. When she stepped in, the room shifted around her. The air seemed thicker, her ears filled with a low hum, as if the walls themselves were vibrating. And there he was again, Ian Holm. This time he was sharper, more solid, seated in the chair by the desk as though he had been waiting all along. His eyes found hers immediately, intense and piercing, the gaze of a man who had spent his life commanding attention. He lifted his hand and gestured, not menacing, not violent, but direct, unmistakable. "Come here." Her body betrayed her mind. Against every instinct, she moved forward, step by step, until she stood near the desk. Holm leaned back slightly, his hand brushing across the scattered pages. Words bled into her vision, lines of dialogue, entire monologues, the voices of Shakespearean kings and doomed men. His lips began to move, reciting them with clarity, his voice filling the room. Claire felt her own mouth opening, the words rising unbidden in her throat. She tried to fight them, but they tumbled out, syllables crisp, the rhythm flawless, as though she had rehearsed them for weeks. When she stopped, gasping, he leaned forward and whispered, "You were perfect." After that night, neither Tom nor Claire could escape the script. The house demanded performances, sometimes in whispers, sometimes in full voices that echoed through the walls. They found themselves pacing, gesturing, reciting dialogue not their own. Arguments broke out between them when one resisted, but the house swallowed those arguments, muffled them, bent them back toward the rhythm of the stage. Sleep came only after lines had been spoken, after scenes had been played. Neighbors began to notice strange sounds at night. Laughter, applause, sudden bursts of dialogue drifting through open windows. More than once, a passerby swore they heard multiple voices inside, though Tom and Claire were the only ones living there. The house seemed to have filled itself with an audience unseen, but present, their silence heavy, their approval felt in the air like static. The final breaking point came during a storm. Rain lashed against the glass, thunder rolled over Hampstead, and the house vibrated with something deeper than weather. Tom and Claire found themselves drawn together into the study, neither speaking, both trembling. The lamp switched on by itself. Pages fanned out across the desk, covered in dialogue. Ian Holm appeared, standing this time, his figure fuller, stronger, his voice steady and commanding. He didn't speak to them at first. He spoke through them. Tom felt his mouth open, words spilling in a cadence not his own. Claire followed, her voice weaving into his, their movements synchronized as though choreographed. The storm outside vanished from their senses. There was only the script, the stage, and the performance. They moved around the study as if it were a set, their lines sharp, their emotions raw, their gestures flawless. When it ended, they collapsed, trembling, tears on their faces, lungs burning. Holmes stood in silence, his eyes fixed on them. Slowly, he raised his hand in a small, deliberate clap. Once, twice, 3 times. And then he was gone. The house never returned to normal. Tom and Claire tried to leave weeks later, but the silence outside felt unbearable. Hotels, friends' homes, even rented flats, none of them held peace. At night, no matter where they were, they woke to the sound of lines whispered in their ears, footsteps pacing across invisible stages, cues waiting to be met, always waiting. Eventually, they went back, not because they wanted to but because they had nowhere else to go. The home house remained their prison, their theater, their stage. And if anyone passed by late at night, they might still hear it. The faint sound of voices rehearsing, the pacing of feet, and every so often, the low rumble of applause from an audience that did not exist. For in that house, the performance never ended.